Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Stacy Pettyjohn, and I direct the Defense Program here at the Center for a New American Security. I'm delighted to have all of you here today in person and online for this really important discussion about the defense industrial base. This is an area of focus for the defense team here at CNAS, as we have a new initiative focused on identifying how we can improve the industrial base so we're prepared for great power competition. And we recently released a report by Becca and Phil Shears, From Production Lines to Front Lines, which is going to be the jumping off point for our conversation today. So we're going to have a couple of components to this conversation. Initially, we are honored to have with us today to start the event some opening remarks from Congressman John Garamendi from the 8th Congressional District of California. He has been at the forefront of Congress's efforts to revitalize the U.S. defense industrial base and one of the House co-sponsors of the SHIPS Act. He's also the ranking member on the House Armed Services Committee's Subcommittee on Readiness, so is very interested in the ties between readiness and industrial production. I'm going to turn it over to him and then we'll move into a panel discussion with our other esteemed guests. Representative Garamendi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I suppose I'm supposed to get all of you really, really excited about building bombs and maybe Abrams tanks and airplanes of all kinds, and I'll do that. There's nothing quite like a war to challenge our assumptions. Not just one war, Ukraine, Russia, but let's talk about the Middle East and all that's going on there, and Israel attacking Iran and the United States joining in all of that. So there's nothing quite like two wars to get us thinking about our military industrial base. Maybe we ought to think about the Pacific also and add in Taiwan, China. There's nothing quite like the current international security situation to cause us to think about our industrial base, our military industrial base. Oh, let's see. We don't have enough 150s, so we go to Romania and ask them to produce the 150s. Maybe Germany can produce a solid rocket motor that we could attach to one or another of our pieces. Bottom line, folks, is we were not prepared. We are simply not prepared. We've atrophied our military-industrial base. Our supply lines are inadequate. Do we make energetics here in the United States, or do we import it? You know the answer to that question. The bottom line is that there's nothing quite like a worldwide conflict taking place in multiple areas of this world to challenge our assumptions that everything's okay back home. Well, it's not. It simply is not. Our military industrial base is very, very limited to a very few, very large companies that dominate most of the sectors. And they've kind of divided up the military industrial programs so that they got this piece, others have that piece, and where are we? We're not able to meet the needs of our military and our allies in the very complex and very dangerous situation in which we find ourselves. We can't do it. Can't do it alone, so we reach out to our allies that have been totally disrespected by the current president in his present term and in his previous term and say, "Ooh, can you help us? Can you participate?" And the answer is, they're not ready either. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we're going to put in $150 billion in the Is it really going to actually happen? Are we actually going to have a reconciliation? Well, if we do, there's a $150 billion slush fund for the Department of Defense to do necessary things. Do we have any idea what those are? Well, they kind of give us an outline. And then, of course, we have the base budget, all of that. We got a problem. We got a very serious problem. Our defense industrial base is limited in the number of participants, particularly the big ones, who have the big contracts. Many of those contracts have been in place. Some of them, had a discussion a few moments ago, a $150 billion contract to build a Sentinel that was never bidded, just handed over to a company to do good things. And the good things have increased in cost probably threefold over the last several years. We got a problem. Can we solve it? Well, it's not that we haven't attempted to solve it. Every year we talk about contracting reform. We talked about procurement reform. Every year we talk about it. And at the end of that year, it's pretty much as it was the previous year, and the next year we're going to go at it again, and indeed we are. The chairman and ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee have put together a piece of legislation called the SPEED Act. Well, history would probably tell us that, yet again, a reform. Will this one actually change anything? I hope so. Certainly we have the right people promoting it, and we shall see. Now, while all of this is going on, there are other things that we need to attend to, and that is a very significant, very important, but totally ignored part of our industrial base. We don't build ships in America. We don't even build the necessary naval vessels in a speedy, efficient way. Every single naval vessel that is contracted is behind schedule, and most of them over cost. And by the way, we don't repair them either. The number of our attack submarines that are laid up for lack of repair, I could take one hand and add half of the other hand, and probably even then underestimate the number of our attack submarines that are simply not useful because they're not repaired. We got a problem here. We got a problem within this entire system. Oh, did I mention the merchant marine? Basically, almost non-existent in the United States. And so we put together a very comprehensive piece of legislation. We call it the SHIPS Act. The good news is that the former head of the the White House office and I were working on this when he was in Congress. And so Mike Walsh, when he went over to the White House, persuaded the president and others to get involved in building ships in America. And so the SHIPS Act, introduced now, bipartisan, bicameral way, is actually moving along. The White House, the president are supporting it. There's support in Congress, both houses, both parties. Maybe we'll actually be able to do something. And that piece of legislation covers the entire, was I going to use the word waterfront? Okay, I'll use the waterfront. It covers all of it. It has funding, a funding mechanism. I suspect the appropriators don't like it because it's guaranteed funding and their ability to play games is somewhat restricted. It has a major piece of legislation that deals with the workers that are going to be necessary if we are to build ships, commercial, non-combat vessels here in the United States. It has money to upgrade the various facilities to build the ships. It's comprehensive. It's work that I and others have been working on for a decade, and we put it all together in one big, no, I wasn't going to say it. Wasn't going to say it. One big piece of legislation. And it has legs, and I think it may actually come together. The problem is we only have 12 referrals in the House of Representatives. So we ought to be able to move very quickly, do you suppose? But it also has a lot of power behind it. Not us, but the industry. The industry, certainly the shipbuilding industry, sees an opportunity for the Navy and their shipbuilding It actually will enhance the ability to build the naval vessels, whether they're submarines or surface, whichever they may be, because the more we are able to build the base, commercial in this case, that will also inure to the benefit of the naval vessel programs. Got a lot of challenges. All of those challenges are informed by the current very dangerous international security situation. And we have learned that we have to change. We cannot do what we've done for the previous 2 decades, 3 decades, and assume that the present industrial base is going to perform. We're going to have to bring into that industrial base newbies, new companies, new creative, innovative companies. And we can do that. We must do it. There's a move to bring into the military commercial applications. Oh my. Gee, that wasn't put together by the big military contractors. It's some new company out there that has developed, I don't know, a drone or an anti-drone system. And we need to reach out to those innovative, often small, but very creative companies and bring them in. So we set up programs within the Department of Defense to do that. And guess what? Within a very, very short period of time, they become bureaucratic. They lose their agility. They lose their ability to move quickly, principally because they don't have the money to bring into the military programs the things that they have discovered out there, whether it's an AI system or whether it is a new observation or an anti-drone program or a drone program. How do we do that? Well, maybe the SPEED Act will help us along the way. But the challenge is for all of you. For all of you that are involved in the defense industrial base, the challenge is very, very significant. You're going to have to change if we are going to be able to meet the incredibly new demands that the security situation in multiple parts of this world will demand of our military. Can you do it? Well, you better. And for those of us that set policy, or at least believe we set policy, and appropriate the money, we're going to have to make sure that the agility, the ability to respond rapidly to the ever-changing environment of conflict, we all have our challenges. And this year is going to show whether we're going to be able to do it. The Trump administration is what it is, not at all clear what it is, sometimes confused, and we're going to see what happens with regard to the reconciliation process. The reconciliation bill will have profound effect on all that I've just talked about. Does it provide money? Yes, but it also hollows out the American social economic system and moves us away from what we really must do with regard to our economy. You are challenged by all of this. Those of us in the Congress and the Senate, we're also seriously challenged to meet this very new and rapidly evolving defense security field on which we must and have no choice but to participate. So I can go on for some time here. I don't know if you want questions. If you do, I'm happy to take them. You can let me know since you're the time police here. Do we have some moment? Do we have some time?
We have a minute or two.
Well, a quick question and a quick answer, and we're at 2 minutes.
Anyone? All right.
Well, I'm looking forward to your panel. My team will be here to listen to your panel. You got some really good people here. Doug and I have worked together for at least 15 years. And Mr. Jones, you and I had a good conversation. So we'll see what happens. And I didn't even get into the Sentinel, did I? Thank you so very, very much.
Congressman, Well, Congressman Garamendi gave us a lot of food for thought and teed up a lot of the topics that we are going to dive into in some more detail with our panel discussion that I'm going to bring up in just 1 second. So we have a really great panel here today, which I'm very excited about, that's going to offer diverse perspectives on the views of the industrial base and what needs to be done. First of all, we have our own Becca, who is the Deputy Director of the Defense Program here at CNAS. We're also joined by the Honorable Doug Bush, the former Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology, as well as Tom Jones, who is the Corporate Vice President and President of the Aeronautics Systems Sector for the Northrop Grumman Corporation. So I'm going to bring them and ask them to come up to the stage right now, and we're going to transition to our panel discussion. Thank you, sir. Good luck getting back to the Hill. So everybody was quiet with the unexpected opportunity for questions, but I want to tee you up that there will be an opportunity for those that are online and in the in-person audience to ask questions of our panelists here today. Unfortunately, the congressman had to get back to the floor because things are happening on the Hill that are important. But if you have questions, please keep them in mind, and if you're online, put them into the chat. Identify yourself, and we will incorporate them into the conversation. So I feel like the congressman did a lot to set up our conversation today, and some of the problems that the industrial base faces, you know, really succinctly saying we're not prepared, which is clear, and that the international environment is incredibly dangerous. I'd like to start by turning to you, Becca, to talk about this a little bit. Because one of the core arguments that you make in your report with Phil is about the link or the lack thereof between the defense industrial base and the U.S. national defense strategy. And while we've had multiple different administrations, the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, now the second one, there's a lot of continuity going back to 2018 in terms of the defense strategies and the fact that they have recognized and prioritized great power competition in general and in particular deterrence against China. But there's this huge disconnect with respect to our defense industrial base, which is still designed as if we were in the post-Cold War era, where the U.S. had qualitative overmatch over any adversary that it faced, and that was more than sufficient for it to defeat lesser adversaries, whether they be terrorists or sort of rogue states like Iraq, at the time and place of its choosing. And that the U.S. could replenish munitions in between conflicts, and that quality was all that matters. The war in Ukraine has reminded us that mass is also important, and quantity is a piece of the puzzle, though not the only one. So, Becca, I'd like you to start us off by outlining some of the characteristics that you think the defense industrial base needs to have to actually support the defense strategy of the United States.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in general, the big finding from the report is that, you know, essentially, defense industrial reality does not match some of the aims of our defense strategy. And that is something that has occurred over time, but it is something that is likely to continue when you look at some of the future trends in warfare that we expect to see. So the potential for a protracted conflict that's going to require more capabilities in certain amounts and the ability to actually reconstitute and replenish those. The potential for simultaneity, which frankly we are already seeing, and what that is going to do in terms of increasing demands and the way that things will change over time. Also, the proliferation of precision weapons across the globe and how that is going to create new challenges for U.S. forces, but also for allies and partners. And this just demonstrates the fact that we are going to need more capabilities in the right amounts, but to be able to actually produce them in a responsive way and sometimes in a more flexible way to enable us to actually be able to have the operational concepts and carry them out in the way that we expect for some of those higher order challenges. So here, part of what we've argued is if we are looking at how to reform the defense industrial base, and we all believe that change is in the offing, it means that there are certain attributes that need to be strengthened. And so one is the fact that we just need more capacity within the defense industrial base. And this isn't just about producing more munitions, more systems, more aircraft. It's about producing the right types of equipment, both high and low, in the right numbers, because we can't go one for one with China, and nor should we. That's going to end up being a cost-imposing strategy on us. There's also the need for greater responsiveness within the defense industrial base. So the ability to actually surge production when something is needed. We've seen in Ukraine, for example, that sometimes the capabilities that were so important at the early stages of the war are not necessarily what are the most important things that are actually changing effects on the battlefield today. So being able to surge production and to be able to switch what we're actually surging is going to be highly important. The other characteristic is flexibility. The ability to actually produce weapons in different ways, looking more towards future manufacturing techniques, ways in which we can design more modular systems, ways that we can be a little bit more innovative and have the flexibility to maybe innovate on the fly. And then the last one, which really shouldn't be understated when we are talking about future great power conflict and the threat posed by China, is the need for greater resilience, the need to have a resilient defense industrial base that can withstand any type of disruption, whether that stems from an adversary itself or just from global conflict.
Great. You hit on a couple of points there that I think are really critical. One is surging and flexibility to do so, and we've seen that our defense industrial base has struggled with that. So I want to bring in Doug and Tom with your particular perspectives from industry and as a former senior government official who had to force the industrial base to surge to meet the needs of Ukraine. I mean, the Biden administration, former Secretary Bill LaPlante was all about production as deterrence, and you lived that spearheading the effort to increase production of 155 shells, as well as Gimlers, Stingers, Javelins, all of the many weapons that were needed on the battlefield in Ukraine. Can you talk about what it took to actually get industry to surge, and what you think is needed in the future, Doug, so that we have a better ability to rapidly do so?
Sure. I mean, the short answer is money. I mean, capacity is a function of investment and time. So I think and by the way, I did a little bit. I had a lot of help. Some great folks I worked with, of course, across the government. And Congress, who provided resources. So the key thing up front was, of course, showing that getting the resources and then getting them on contract quickly. But I think that revealed the time factor that maybe people had kind of forgotten about or just assumed away, that mobilization timeline for serious industrial activities is at least a year, more like 18 months, sometimes 2 years, to dramatically scale. Not increase a little bit, but to dramatically scale. And we didn't have unlimited resources either. It was still it wasn't a World War II situation. That said, once the resources arrived, I was actually mostly pleasantly surprised at industry's responsiveness. Once we got on contract, once we had the money in place, all the great things about America, which is we have ingenuity, we have innovation, we have terrific management, we have companies that have sophisticated capital structures, and we have sophisticated capital markets that leveraged. All of that magic came into play. So, and actually is producing way more weapons in those categories you mentioned, which I know isn't everything, but we've kind of done a test case. And yes, you can do it, but there's a time factor and there's a resources factor. And so I don't think all the lessons are negative. I think that would be one of my things, is we're actually still pretty good at this when we're serious about it. So when the resources arrive, working with defense industry and our military experts in the DoD, we were able to ramp and produce, and we are producing now. That time factor in terms of learning lessons, I think is the most critical one is we've done this. What elements of that time element with smart policies or future investments can we reduce? Because maintaining a World War III production scale when we're not in World War III is a pretty big ask of the American people. But what can we do to be prepared to go much faster next time? I think to me that was the one lesson I took away. The money showed up. What can we do now so the next time we have to do this, we can do it a lot quicker? I think that's my big thing.
Those are excellent points. I think it is important to recognize the success and the tremendous feat that you all achieved in terms of being able to ramp up production when the will and the money was there and the forces aligned. Tom, I want to turn to you now because while I love munitions and we've been talking about them and we know they're important, there are different types of weapons capabilities. And I think the recent U.S. strike on Iran highlighted some really important ones that are very exquisite, namely the B-2 stealth bombers, which were able to enter hostile airspace and drop the biggest conventional weapons that exist in the world today. And that is something that is different in terms of the level of complexity and time that it takes to construct compared to 155. Neither's easy, but it's just a different order of magnitude. As we're thinking about deterring China, one of the capabilities that comes up again and again is more long-range air power. Is there a way to surge production of the B-21 bombers? Or to surge aircraft production more generally going forward?
So I think there is, but it's a complex problem, and as the Secretary stated, it comes with a price tag, right? So first of all, don't have any munitions background. I did manufacture electronics for a while and mostly aircraft lately, so I'll talk a lot about tooling and things like that. If you go and look at Freedom's Forge, which is a great book, I thought, I just happened to read it about 6 months before I got assigned to go run the aeronautics sector, so it's very appropriate homework, if you will. If you go back and look at that time frame, it was about a 2 to 3 year start, right? We were able to rally and get arms ready because Roosevelt foresaw the need, enlisted the help of the $1 men to come in and kind of start figuring out how do we tool. And as was stated, it's kind of about a 2 year ramp these days, which is actually, I think, pretty good given the complexity of the systems that we're building now as compared to what we're building in World War II is significantly more. But it really comes down to, in the case of aircraft, it's all the same things that limited us and Freedom's Forge limit us today. It's the factories, it's floor space, it's the tooling. Once you get that running and in your supply chain, I think you have a lot of ability to look at how you can scale, ramp production, surge, if you will. So, you know, if we look at some of the inherent problems we have in the current system that make that difficult, one of them is the allowability of that extra surge capacity, right? So the fastest way would be to be able to have spare factory space sitting around that you could go into and utilize. The way the system's set up right now, none of that is allowable cost. So for a contractor to build a spare building on speculation that it someday might need it, actually ties up a bunch of cash, and that is the one thing in commercial economics that never changes is what goes out, you have to get something coming back in to fill that. So if you build that excess capacity, you aren't actually able to recoup the cost of that. That limits your ability to invest in other things that might have near-term needs. So I think, number one, we need to look at how we can get the allowability of surge capacity in there. I think advanced manufacturing techniques, I'm very bullish on determinate manufacturing as a method of reducing the amount of tooling. You're not going to get completely away from tooling, but anything that can reduce the amount of tooling, again, goes into reducing the lead time that you need to set things up there. So, I mean, those are, in terms of being able to ramp, that is the two things that are in the critical path. I think we showed pretty successfully on the B-21 program. I was in Palmdale as we were ramping up production from one aircraft to more than one, but I can't say that what that is. But you know, we're in production now, and you know, I think industry understands how to take even a workforce that's not trained and get them trained up to the skill level. The really difficult part is in getting that initial setup, having the facilities that you need, having the capital equipment, having the tooling, and there's ways we can do that. Once we're in production, if we could keep a slow level of production rolling on. Another idea I heard someone say the other day, could we set up production spaces and do prototype manufacturing programs so that the factory was basically full? Maybe not with the end product, but you had a factory that was generating revenue, that was generating returns, so that you had the cash flow to offset that. Again, unfortunately, that's something that comes with the price tag. Another thing I was thinking of actually on the drive-in, you know, if you look at surging capabilities that have been in production for a while, think about how we deal with diminished manufacturing sources, or DMS. There's a cost trade there that says, you know, hey, if I'm towards the back end of my production, I'm probably just going to make a lifetime buy. If you need to surge that capability later on, you have to go basically do redesigns around that. So maybe making more conscious decisions as we're in production about how we handle diminishing manufacturing sources and other things to make sure that if we ever need to step on the gas, we don't have a 12-month or 18-month redesign cycle in there because we bought enough for 100 and now suddenly there's a need for 150 and we don't have enough parts. So, you know, there's a bunch of subtleties in how we execute our business, but then also the big picture of how do we have that capacity sitting on the side and not have it be useless, right? Because empty factories are potential, but empty factories are also a sign of economic malaise on the other hand, right? So anyways, that was a bit rambling, I'm sorry.
No, that highlighted a lot of important points, and I think you hit on one of the key dilemmas, and that Doug also mentioned, which is, you know, this comes with a cost, and you're trying to figure out where you can smartly make those investments that will have the best impact or be the most productive so that you don't just have excess capacity lying around fallow. Do you want to add anything on this, or you?
I mean, I just think the most important point to make is that at the end of the day, all of the things that you've just both mentioned, it requires changing existing paradigms of how we do business, how we do production. It's moving from just-in-time efficiency to accepting risk in certain areas, accepting risk for having some of that excess capacity, accepting risk when it comes down to making some bets on perhaps long lead items that you expect that you might need to at least give you some of that inherent flexibility. That's not going to be possible for everything, but that is something that is a bit different from how we've been thinking about production traditionally, but is an area where honestly the government and industry need to come to some form of agreement in order to create these new paradigms of production.
So if I could add on, because I think that's a great point, Becca, and I think there's some things that government could do actually to help industry in that particular area. Because, you know, I think all of industry, we've certainly seen it with some of the new entrants coming in with private equity and venture capital money. The big primes as well. I mean, we've spent $13.5 billion in capital and research and development over the last 5 years. That's a lot of money to spend on speculation because we believe that there's a need there. So I think if industry gets clear signals that there's an intent to do something, if you see the budget, and more importantly, if there's stability in that budget and demand, that provides business people, whether they work at large primes such as myself or some of the innovative disruptor companies that are coming up, to really be able to figure out where do you spend that precious capital, because it is capital. There's a finite amount of it, and we have to figure out where to put those bets. I think one of the successes of the B-21 program, it's been very stable in requirements, it's been very stable in funding, and there's been an intent around exactly what that program looks like. And that has led to, you know, some pretty superior results in terms of executing on cost, on schedule and meeting technical requirements. So I think if we can keep those elements in there, that enables industry to be able to figure out what bets to make.
That consistency is clearly inconsistency in resources, which is so difficult. I mean, you have a customer that's consistent in asking for what they want and not changing the requirements and coming up with a reasonable set that are flexible enough that they can adjust over time as technologies change. But this highlights the role of Congress, right? And part of the dilemma that I think industry and the Pentagon struggle with is the fact that living on CRs and delayed funding really makes it very hard to be consistent and to plan. And the year-to-year budget process, which brings me to my next point. I wanted to ask you, Doug, not about the budget process, but we did highlight that some of the challenges are real physical real-world things, training people, having the machine tooling to build different weapons, but some of it is self-inflicted, that our own processes are a certain time and require certain things. And I think there is a question about the level of risk that we want to accept in terms of whether we should change some of our processes. And it looks to me, and we're in very early days, obviously, that the Trump administration may be willing to accept more risks. You saw the Test and Evaluation Office in the Department of Defense getting halved. Do you think that there are regulations that we should change, or are there different ways that we can change our processes to move faster, or is that just too risky and something that we don't want to do because we don't want to actually build any weapons that don't work?
So I think I'd start with principles, not policy. Principle of having the best equipment in the world is not one that should be compromised. So the whole world has seen during the war in Ukraine and then what's happening now in the Middle East that we make the best things. Our stuff actually works in combat. I don't know what other demonstration you could possibly want rather than the last 2.5 years of tragically significant scale warfare. But in that, you see how good our weapons are. That doesn't just happen. That's not a naturally occurring thing. That's the work of thousands of people in industry making things at high quality, our people doing quality checks, testing to make sure the design is robust across the wide range of things we have to design for. So number one, I don't think that should be compromised. The second thing we should not compromise is, to the degree we can, the safety of our people using these weapons. Now, everybody watches videos about the last half a second of a weapon's life, of it having its terminal effect. But there are often years before that where design factors like making sure it's safe to store, making sure it's safe to handle, making sure that there's appropriate design elements in place to where we don't have an accident that costs the lives of our troops. That also doesn't just happen. So effectiveness and safety I don't think are compromisable. What we do need is I think policy improvements in two areas. One is our planning policies, meaning how do we think about what the need is. So what would that look like? I think when I was in the administration, I used the term once, mobilization O-plan. This is, the department is exquisitely good at planning for conflicts. We should become exquisitely good at planning for mobilization. So apply the same rigor and internal capacity, working very closely with industry, because they would have to, unlike war plans, they would have to be much more involved in gaming out what that looks like, finding the hard points in advance, rehearsing the plan, doing it every year, just like we do with war plans. We update them. You put new data in, use new data analysis tools that are legion. We have to get serious about that if we're going to talk about mobilization. We have to actually plan for it in a serious way. So that's one policy. The other one is there is something to be said for, in new tech areas in particular, designing for producibility to a greater degree. That's fine. That's a good conversation to have without compromising those first two things. So, you know, I do hear a lot the 80% is good enough talking point, unless, here's the unless that 20% is what gets you killed. All right, so the people that make those judgments are traditionally our uniformed leadership. They are the ones ultimately responsible for taking and accepting that risk. As long as there are fulsome conversations about what that 20% means. If it means we can have 10,000 of something versus 1,000, that's a judgment we need to make. We just need to make it with facts, not assertions. So yes, there are places where we could choose to have a little less capability perhaps, but much vaster scale and lower cost. It could make a lot of sense. We just need to make those calls carefully, is what I would say. It's not a panacea.
Stacy, could I comment on your observation on the operational test and developmental test? Because I'm actually pretty optimistic, again, that there's technological answers coming forward that are going to help us take time out of test. It's interesting, if you look at some of the, I think it was RAND did some studies for the Air Force a while back looking at the time it takes to do DT-OT on major weapon systems, and basically found that all the innovations that were coming online, basically the complexity of the aircraft was advancing at a scale that you never really ate into that developmental test time. We actually spend on advanced aircraft, we spend as much time in DT-OT as we do from the initial start of the contract through fielding the first product. So those two are equal. So if we can go and attack that back end, we're working every day as contractors, we're working very diligently on trying to compress the front end. If we can attack the back end, there's a lot of savings in terms of getting capability to the warfighter faster. I think that digital engineering has shown some real promise. We've noticed just unbelievable correlation on B-21 between our digital models and what we're actually seeing on everything from loads test through some of the things in flight test. You know, our hope is as we gain more confidence in these, as we build a infrastructure and knowledge base around how to interpret digital models and experimental test data, combine them, we can start reducing test points, which is going to compress that time that we've got in the back end. And that, I think, so, you know, I am actually hopeful that as we launch into this next generation of aircraft, you know, finishing up B-21, F-47, hopefully the FAXX program soon, that we're going to see the windfall of these digital technologies being able to compress not just the front-end design cycle, but also be able to add certainty and reduce time in DT and OT.
I know we probably want to move off of this topic, but let me just jump in and be a little bit more of a divisive figure. We have to move faster. If we want to build the military that we need to face some of the future threats that we are planning for, we need to go a lot faster. And so that's not to say that we should be taking shortcuts on important things related to test and evaluation and the safety of our forces, and frankly, the safety of civilians worldwide. Those are not decisions we should be making. That said, as much as I love the Department of Defense, there's a great deal of excess bureaucracy that could always be streamlined, that could always be changed in some way. There's also so many processes that are not necessarily going to be some of these ones related to design, related to the actual hardware, to the actual employment, where we can make some of those efficiencies and gain back some time so we can push out capabilities to the hands of the warfighter faster. There's also that question of risk. Where do we want to accept risk to be able to push things out, to be able to do the proper amount of experimentation? Because quite often we are building capabilities or thinking up capabilities that we think that there's a clear operational need for. But you get it into the hands of folks in CENTCOM and Indo-Pacom for an exercise, or even sometimes for something akin to a real-world operation, and they tell you all the ways in which it is not fit for their purpose. Or they'll tell you the ways in which it is fit for their purpose, but it's totally different from the one that you initially designed for. So we need to move ahead in order to try and find where some of those process gains could be made, but this is also what's going to be required if we want to build a high-low mix of capabilities, because some of the rigorous testing and evaluation that we have for some of the most exquisite offensive systems might not necessarily be what we need for some of those lower cost attritable systems that are perhaps maybe undertaking a logistics mission, or something that's going to get around some of the key operational problems that we face, like contested logistics in the Indo-Pacific. So just thinking a little bit more about that as probably one of the ways in which we need to move forward. The other thing that I'll say is, I think we are making some progress right now when it comes down to bringing in some of the non-traditionals and the new entrants into the DIB, and we're seeing some wins there. But for the most part, those are wins in test and evaluation contracts that haven't necessarily pivoted to full-on contracts where we need to see scaled production. There's an open question there. So we need to move eventually to some of those to see if some of the new entrants can scale production at the level that we would need, particularly for some of the amounts of capabilities that we would want in order to hedge against some of the potential threat that we see in the future.
You nicely provided me with a segue to the topic I wanted to turn to next, which is the non-traditional defense space or the commercial sector and how we leverage that. I'm going to bring in one of the questions from the online audience and expand it a little bit. But Sydney had asked, he said, in World War II, we built a war-winning force with converted civilian factories. Today, how much can DoD piggyback on our world-leading software and AI industries, or is that something that we can't leverage? We know, for since the Obama administration, when the Defense Innovation Unit was created, we've been trying to tap into the non-traditional defense sector, or the private sector more. Do you think that this is a good idea? Is this one of the areas that we need to move in, and how can we actually realize this instead of just going through what some people have dismissively pointed to as like innovation theater?
So yes, of course we can, and we are. So the idea that the Department of Defense is not buying software and finding ways to use AI is just demonstrably false. Now, not everybody's getting a contract. Sorry, not sorry. But a lot of people are, and they're doing great things. So we, of course, in government and working with Congress, and we need to make the paths to adopting new technology, better technology, and using America's strengths, including, of course, our terrific software industry. Yes, we need to clear a brush to make those things easier. So when leaders in the department choose to invest in a new tech area, you get immediate or as fast as possible returns. So yeah, I just say it is happening. How much is often a function of just investment. The department has many needs. We also need good barracks. We also need test ranges. We also need to pay people. We need health care. So, the leaders of this administration, like all, are being confronted with these choices right now, and I'm sure they'll do their very best to work through them. But of course, where we can, yes, we should find ways to be able to do, especially new things that aren't as routine, to give them a push to enable them to go faster. So I think there's a lot of bright signs, actually, of that in the department before I arrived, while I was there, and actually still continuing. I think people in the department see the need.
Yeah, I absolutely think that we should embrace and work with these small companies. Just last week, we announced a new aircraft, optionally autonomous, if you will, called Beacon. We've signed an MOA already with 4 small AI-based companies. There's several others in the hopper that we're going to try and get pinned down in the next few weeks, where basically we're taking open architecture autonomy, bringing these contractors on board and jointly operating and testing at a very, very low dollar per flight hour cost, which enables a lot of rapid experimentation to go out there. So I think it's incumbent not just on the Department of Defense to find these companies, it's incumbent on primes to go out and do that as well. I think it's healthy having new entrants in the space. Personally, I like competition. I'm just kind of wired that way. But I also like collaboration. So I think it's good. The competition sharpens everyone's edge. The collaboration gives us an opportunity to get outside the mindset of working in a, highly regulated monopsony. Hope I pronounced that correctly for a long time, right? So I think there's a lot of potential out there. I think, unfortunately, there's some who portrayed it as it's a us versus them. I don't think it has to be that way. And quite frankly, the level of the threat that we are facing is so significant, is so challenging. We don't have time to turn this into a us versus them, other than the standard, regular competition that we have to make sure we get the best product. We need to figure out how to work together. And the overarching theme, I agree with you, maybe not as divisive, very passionate, but I think we all agree we need to change things. We need to get capability out to the warfighter faster. And anything we can do, whether it's in the mainline exquisite programs like B-21s and FAXXs, or if it's bringing in CCAs and other things like that, we need to figure out how to do that.
So as you obviously know, we at CNAS are doing a lot of work when it comes down to AI and autonomy and how it relates to the future of war. So all of that and more to what you said. But I think here we have to look at the way in which we see trends that are going to be shaping the future of warfare and the role that you see software playing in that. We've seen so much of this in Ukraine. Imagine what it could be like with more development time, with some of the capabilities that, frankly, our unique defense industrial base can bring to bear. I think there's also something to be said about thinking about how we can leverage software creatively in the future to actually keep some of our capabilities in service longer. Maybe they don't have, their initial role is not necessarily what we would want them to be doing. And so is there a way in which we can push out software packages to be able to help them have almost a second life, if you will? So just, again, trying to think a little bit creatively about the ways in which we can leverage software in order to make it so that we have capabilities that are mission relevant for the future operations we expect to face.
Okay. Audience, you're being very patient. I'm going to ask one more series of questions before I bring in some of the in-person audience questions. And I'd like to turn to the issue of resilience in supply chains. We saw with COVID and really recognized that our supply chains were fragile and that they could easily be disrupted, and that would have ripple effects throughout the economy, but also for defense industry. There's also concerns about adversary manipulation of supply chains, whether they could have leverage over you and inhibit your ability to build different things. So I think figuring out how we improve our supply chain and some of those sub-tier suppliers and component makers that are so critical to the final products is really important. Tom, in your experience as a member of industry, what are some of the challenges and opportunities you've seen in integrating new sources of supply into, weapons production?
So I think I'd like to answer that in actually two parts, the part you asked and then another element to the first part. So, in terms of introducing new suppliers, oftentimes we deal with, fairly small suppliers. There's like tier ones and tier twos that are $1 billion or hundreds of $1 million of companies. There's also ones that are tens of millions. Trying to make sure that we get the quality, the manufacturing processes right, that they know how to manage their own supply chain, right? I mean, we actually spend a lot of time, even with companies that are, in the $100 million of revenues, sending in our manufacturing engineers, our quality experts, our global supply chain people, trying to help bring them along in terms of what does it take to establish a well-ordered line of balance to make sure you have continuity of products. So I'd say just some of the skills of, when you're developing a component that goes into a much more expensive component, all of a sudden it's a lot more important that that flange gets there on time than if you're just sending it to the local hardware store for, people to repair their doors with. So I'd say bringing in that expertise and quality in manufacturing is where we spend a lot of time focusing, bringing new suppliers on. But it's something we can do. We do it every day, right? So, that's something that, again, if you want dual sources, it costs money, right? So that's the problem a lot of times when we go, hey, we could dual source this. How much does it cost? No, not worth it. So we need to figure that part of the equation out. I think also we need to really understand the pains that some of these small companies go through. A lot of times they might have one big customer that their entire lifeblood runs on, right? So again, getting back to constancy, predictability, having things budgeted, those hiccups in funding, those decisions, I'm going to suddenly slash what I'm procuring, by 50%. I'm going to give you this much time to figure out what to do about it. That can just cause tremendous ripples in these small companies. And I'd say right now, as we're coming out of really compounding effects of, you have COVID followed by the Great Resignation, followed by hyperinflation, followed by, at least in my industry, a lot of turmoil in the commercial aviation business. Those suppliers are really struggling. And, it's interesting, when COVID was on, I felt like I was a backup human resources officer because I was just dealing with human resources issue. These days, I feel more like a global supply chain person because that's where I spend a lot of my time. So what can we do? Again, it starts with the customer, and then we flow that down, making sure, do we have the right contracts set up? Are we providing that reliability in funding? Are we having favorable payment terms so that people aren't waiting long periods of time? Because when you have to make payroll in your small company, that's a big deal. So I think we need to make sure that not only do we try and ingest more suppliers into the supply chain, but let's look at this from a business lens in terms of how we keep those small suppliers healthy. Because if you have one or two instances where you got to put your house up for second mortgage to make payroll because the big defense program didn't go through, guess what? You don't want to do defense programs anymore. So we need to do a better job making sure we're setting up business-friendly contracts. That starts at the top and flows down.
Can I ask you, I want you to follow up on this topic, but specifically I was hoping you would touch on two issues that I know you have some experience with. One is obsolescence in supply chains. I know something you mentioned, like the Stinger line was basically cold, barely running when you had to ramp it up, and how you managed to restart that. And then the other piece is sort of adversary penetration and potential manipulation. We've seen Israel launch this very impressive supply chain attack on Hezbollah. Is that something that you worried about when you were in the department? And how did you prepare and defend against it?
So with regard to the first one, difficult calls to make on how much you invest in very old technology, which Stinger was when we were confronted with the need to ramp up, versus moving to the new thing. In that case, we did decide that the gap to the new thing was sufficiently long to warrant investment in more of the older yet still very effective system, and that was done. But it took longer, of course, because it had gone not entirely dead, but pretty cold. So of course it took longer compared to other things where we were making a lot of them. So increasing the rate was much easier for all the reasons with suppliers that was just very well articulated. Yeah, I think you got to make those tough calls. With regard to risk, I think there's a lot of good news here, actually. So administration before I was there, my time, and I think continuing, the government, I think, is much more attuned and has invested in tools to be more aware of these supply chain risks itself. Before COVID, there was a bit of an assumption that industry would handle this for us entirely. I think the government realized that the government doesn't need to micromanagement, but needs more awareness of what the risks are, so that where government does need to intervene, which isn't everywhere, we can have that conversation with data, make informed choices, invest with our industry partners to reduce risk of certain risks in supply chain. I think that's there's been tremendous progress on that. Actually, if you go back kind of about 6 years, I think a lot of good things have happened by a lot of people across the department working with industry. We today, I think, have much more resilient supply chains for most major weapon systems than we had if you were to go back to that time frame. That'll require continued effort. There is a fine balance to put there, though, between the government micromanaging and doing it itself, which I was always leery of. I believe in the market, where we could let industry do what they do best, manage suppliers with government awareness and shared risk in the same site picture. That's where we found the most success, not the government micromanaging and becoming the one doing it for industry. Outside risk of supply chain disruption, sure, that's always there. I think the mitigation tools are there if we're smart about them. You can stockpile, of course, in advance, which we did for a lot of conventional munitions constituent parts and materials. And And then you can just take good security measures like improving cyber resiliency of our industrial partners at a reasonable cost. You're never going to be perfect. So what you want is a system that's resilient and can handle shocks. And this is where our fallback to having the most innovative country in the world and the most capable defense industry in the world, in my view, and the most sophisticated capital markets and the American people's inherent talent for figuring it out, that's what we fall back on. But we've made, I think, a lot of progress, way more to do, and we can't be asleep at the switch to potential disruption from a more serious state actor like China or Russia to our supply chains.
All right, audience, you've been very patient in person. Are there any questions? Here, can you please wait for the microphone, then identify yourself and.
Thank you so much. Terrific commentary this morning. My name is Joanne Lestraco. I'm with the Government of Canada. I'm just curious about your thoughts on the broader defense industrial base, allies, partners. How does this factor into your view of scaling and seeing the world in this new security paradigm?
So just my personal view, but it was also my experience, is that, America, I think, we talk about the arsenal of democracy, but I used to use a term, we need a arsenal of democracies. We need all of our allies to also invest and have resilient capability that we all draw on together. So if we're going to we're going to defend our values as an alliance of democracies, then we all have to invest and work together and be transparent and leverage that massive. If you look at the GDP numbers, when you add everybody up, it's not a bad picture. We just have to use it well. So and I think what we found is we have integrated supply chains across the world. Those aren't going to go away. We just need to be a bit smarter about them to make sure they're with friends, and then make sure that we're taking steps to assure our allies that we're going to be there to work with them, because for any serious conflict, we're going to need really the entire Western world, the entire, not just the West, but the entire alliance of free countries to work together against some of the scale of threats that you were mentioning we might face. So Canada in particular, we have a deep and highly integrated defense industrial base that's absolutely critical, certainly for the Army, that was absolutely essential for ramping up, and I think would be in the future.
So if I may, I think here there's something to be said about looking at the current administration's push to reindustrialize America. And this is a pretty massive undertaking. It is both defense industrial base, but also broadly the commercial and manufacturing industrial base. But the thing that isn't really being said out loud is all of those efforts are going to take years, if not decades, to actually come to fruition. So if there's going to be this reindustrialization of America and this ramp up of American industry, okay, as we wait to maybe try and onshore some of those, there's going to be a gap. So where can that gap actually be served and filled? And it is continuing to cooperate with allies and partners. And so there is a sense of you cannot throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I'm a little bit afraid of that is what's happening, because things like tariffs are making it all the more difficult for America to reindustrialize, because guess what? It just made defense industrial base production so much more expensive. But it's also making it hard for some of our allies and partners to actually rely on us and to be able to have the industrial relationships with us that, frankly, both we and they need.
Yeah, I mean, Becca and I have written a lot about allies and partners and looked closely at the DIB components of it, and it's so essential and so needed. Doug's right, but so complicated. Like when I looked at the guided weapons and explosive ordnance cooperation with Australia, it's hard to figure out how you make this happen, and you do it in a way where it strengthens supply chains and doesn't just stretch them. But it is something that hopefully the U.S. continues to pursue. In the back.
Thanks. Ben Froman with the House China Select Committee. Really appreciate the discussion today. My question is on supply chains. I'm glad that Freedom's Forge was brought up, fantastic book. One of my read of that book tells me two things, and tell me if you agree. One was that in World War II, part of our ability to rapidly scale was we had a robust commercial manufacturing base. And two, it seems like a lot of our supply chains did not go through other countries and certainly did not go through China. Today, in my view, those two things have changed. My question for the panel maybe would be, to what extent does the eroding of our commercial manufacturing base hinder our ability to rapidly and resiliently scale production in a time of crisis? And two, to what extent is China being in our supply chains for things like critical minerals, maybe castings and forgings, or other components also present a threat? And kind of to that last point too, do we even know, do we have a good idea of what the extent of China's role in our defense supply chains is? Thanks.
Easy question.
So we do know. All right, so I think the Department of Defense has the information it needs to, working with industry, to at least know where the risks are. That's not a small thing. That required investment and effort, but I think working, including Congress, is focused on just that risk to the supply chain regarding China was important. So progress made. Now, what to do about it? So I think de-risking of supply chains is something, and it's not just China, but of course there would be the major concern, is something that several administrations in a row now have been trying to do and are doing, working with our industry partners to make sure we can do that. You just have to be smart about it. Now, here's where the World War II comparison gets a little hard by the day because it was so long ago. The world of the mid-1930s, which is really the economy we mobilized from, it's a long time ago. A lot's happened since then. We've had globalization happen, and I don't believe it's going to be undone. We just have to be, with regard to security issues and production of things that protect America, be much smarter and much more informed globalization that is appropriately we de-risk. I think it's happening, but it's not free. It could increase cost in some cases, but we just need to have an honest conversation about, if we're going to get away from, for example, China's a source for things, what's the investment required to do that, and we need to be everybody kind of operating off the same numbers.
Yeah, so I agree with your comment. We've got a very good feel for where our material comes from, and actually have, in some cases, regulatory requirements to know the source of where material comes from, depending on what it is. So that I see as a little bit less of a risk. I do agree. There was a decision in the late 1990s, early 2000s that manufacturing was kind of passé, and we're going to be more of a service-based, information-based economy. I regret that. From my perspective, I think we need to build things as well, and we see the trend moving that way. I think, the great thing you mentioned a couple times, capitalism works. It does. So if we can express the need, if we can, again, say a demand, that space will be filled. I frequently, when I'm at conferences and we start talking about the defense industrial base, we need to start promoting the trades in this country again. You can make a phenomenal living in the trades, right? The neighborhood, when I was a director, lower level executive living in California, I lived in a nice neighborhood, but I was one of the few white-collar people there. It was plumbers, it was carpenters, it was, people that had come up in the trades, owned their own businesses, and now they were the people in the big fancy houses. So you can get a phenomenal living there. So we need to do more to promote getting in the trades, and I think once we promote, what I've seen on B-21, we can train people very fast. I like to say the B-21 is put together by bartenders, babysitters, and baristas. Why do I say that? Because when I go out and I walk the floor and I talk to people out there, I go, what was the last job you had before you came here? And those are the answers I get. I was a server at TGI Fridays, right? Now they're putting together the most sophisticated aircraft in the history of the world, right? And doing a hell of a good job at it, right? So if there's a need there, industry knows how to take those people in, how to train them, how to give them the skills, how to put the infrastructure in to make sure the quality is there, and you can have a lifetime career. So I think that we can get there. Again, it gets back to, you need a clear sign that we're doing this. You need to budget like we're going to do it, and we need to have constancy in that demand.
I'm going to hope that we don't get there. For a few reasons. One, that means that deterrence has failed because it means that we will be in some type of world war, right? In order to have that kind of mobilization again, I think we are looking at a very different world than the one that we live in, and I hope that is not the direction that we go. I am not personally a fan of trying to make some of these through lines from World War II mobilization to today. I think there's a lot of reasons why it just would be a very different environment, essentially, in part because there is the greater complexity of weapons. Even though it sounds like you've made great strides in being able to train up people, it requires being able to actually get commercial industry to allow the use of their facilities, which I would probably argue, absent some type of major contingency or war, that is not necessarily going to be forthcoming. So again, very different situation from what we faced. And then it also requires, frankly, there being a very different state citizen bargain than the one that we have today. One of the things that when I was staffing the National Defense Strategy Commission, the commissioners kept on harping on, and I think they're quite right, which is the American public is not necessarily well set up for some of the sacrifices that would be required if we found ourselves on more of that war footing. And some of this comes back to industry. The fact that we don't necessarily think always in our head of the defense industrial base as being part of public service. But if you go to a shipyard, if you go and you talk to someone on a factory floor and you ask them why they're doing this, yeah, it's a paycheck. But quite oftentimes it is that they see that they are contributing to something that is bigger than themselves. And that is not necessarily how the rest of the American public sees it. So we have to maybe start thinking about how we might shift some of those paradigms if we are going to try to at least set the conditions for any type of larger scale defense industrial base mobilization, should it be needed, which I certainly hope it won't be needed.
Yeah.
Thank you. Noah Robertson here with Defense News. Doug had the immense pleasure of being covered by me when he was in the building. A question for all members of the panel. There are multiple efforts right now in the administration, the Pentagon, and also Congress to try to speed up the Pentagon's buying practices to make it easier to do business with them. I'm wondering how much you think those efforts matter when you consider that the overall problem still seems to be the supply of the defense industrial base and what it's capable of surging in the first place. So making the pipeline easier to move through, but still having a choke point at the front.
Well, I think the system can always be improved, and I think the two reform, efforts by the Senate and House both have a lot of very good things in them to just make it easier for the department to go faster. While maybe accepting a little more risk on cost and making a little more risk on how fast we can ramp things up, but those are good things. So I think enabling, to me, the key thing was reforms that enable us to get capital to industry faster to let them do what they do best, which is use it and leverage the inherent amazing qualities of the American people. I think those things are underway, and I think those improvements we're looking at will help. I think the capacity issue, like I said, is an investment question. So what can we do? And yes, we want to deter war. We don't want to be in one. All wars are terrible. Is to spend more money, in my opinion, now on building our stocks of weapons so that we have more time to mobilize when we have to. That is how you buy time in that scenario. And then working with industry and academia on new manufacturing methods. So ways to just make things better and smarter. More automated production, more use of advanced materials. So we don't have to always make things the old way. Find out the new way to make things that achieve some of the goals that have been talked about. So there's always going to be some risk. But I think, showing we're serious about munitions means over multiple administrations, putting the money down, buying the weapons. A lot of magic will follow if we just do that, because the market will do its thing. And we'll build our workforce. We'll have these experienced folks who are able to stay in the industry because things are going well. They will turn into even more effective people who train the next generation. So it's going to take time, and it has to carry across multiple administrations if it's going to be meaningful.
I'm going to give Tom and Becca, this is our last chance. We're running up against our stop time. If you have any closing thoughts or any response to Noah's question that you want to jump in with.
I think in terms of any type of process reform, the proof is really in the details. So here, I want to point to foreign military sales, right? There's been an executive order that they're going to reform the FMS process for the umpteenth time. This comes after several DoD Tiger teams on FMS reform. There have been several congressional task forces on FMS reform. We are doing a lot of reform theater, to put a riff on innovation theater, if you will. It comes down to what are we actually going to do to actually create a change in a process. Right now, I'm hearing on that, for example, is there's going to be a different way of prioritizing who goes to the front of the list. But until I see some type of actual methodology and one that makes sense, it's just saying that there's going to be some type of procedural reform. So it really just comes down to, is it going to be something that actually changes things? And is it going to be worthwhile? Or is this just sort of saying something to do something?
I think reform across all aspects of how we build capacity in the defense industrial base is a positive thing. We spent a lot of time today talking about supply chain. We talked about what we can do as large industry. We talked about how we can collaborate with small entrants. I think, quite frankly, many of the regulatory reforms that could be put in place to allow who could move to the front of the line in terms of smaller players would benefit some of us large companies that, frankly, if we didn't have to deal with this or that regulation, we could move faster as well. I was talking last week in an interview around the Beacon aircraft that we just rolled out. That whole job, converting an existing aircraft and redesigning elements of it, going to fly-by-wire, occurred in a little over 12 months, probably, before it takes its first flight. The digital pathfinder it was based on, the original aircraft, was done in about 2 years. So there is the ability, even for large companies like Northrop Grumman, to move very fast. Those were internally funded, internally regulated. So I do believe that the regulatory environment can help across the board, not just by opening the space up for some new entrants to come in and bring what they can do, but also I think can help the efficiency of larger established contractors. And as I said before, we need every player on the field if we're going to win this game. So.
All right, we are out of time here. I'd like to thank our wonderful panelists for this very spirited discussion that actually, and this is a rare thing, I'm leaving this conversation more hopeful than I went in. I'd like to thank Congressman Garamendi for setting the stage and giving us a warning of the problems and sort of some of the things that need to be done. And I hope you all have a great day.